Welcome to Noir channel. We are about to present to you Every Moth to Its Candle, a traditional murder mystery story. Enjoy. Water lapped against the pilings with a rhythmic slap as their water taxi pulled alongside the private dock at Giudecca. The air carried the brine of the canal mixed with the sweet, heavy scent of blooming jasmine drifting from the hotel gardens. Detective Martin stepped onto the wet wood first, steadying himself on the slick planks before offering a hand to Tonya. She accepted it, her grip firm and dry despite the damp mist clinging to her glasses. They had traveled far for this assignment, yet the island felt suspended in time, unmoved by the frantic pace of modern Venice. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of Murano chandeliers that cast intricate patterns across the ceiling. Signora Adelheid Kessler stood behind the reception desk, her posture rigid as she adjusted a stack of guest manifests with precise movements. She looked up when they approached, her eyes sharp and assessing without being overtly hostile. "The director expects you in the garden wing," she said, her voice carrying that dry, uninflected tone unique to those who had served this hotel for decades. Martin nodded once while Tonya confirmed their access codes on her tablet. They found Dr. Cosima Ravetti near the edge of the Foxglove garden, kneeling in the dirt with a magnifying lens pressed close to her eye. She wore a practical linen shirt stained with soil and grease from her field equipment. A small drone hovered above her head, its rotors barely audible as it captured thermal data on the pollinator activity below. "You are here for the observation," she stated, eyes still trained on the insects crawling over the purple blooms, her voice calm and focused entirely on her work. Martin kept his hands in his pockets while Tonya watched the woman work with professional curiosity. A man emerged from the greenhouse at the garden's far end, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that looked too clean for such labor. Dario Bellini moved with an air of practiced formality, though a flicker of tension tightened his jaw as he noticed their presence. "Dr. Ravetti has been quite busy lately," he said, addressing Martin directly while keeping his eyes on the flowers. His English was precise, yet he stumbled slightly over a vowel before correcting himself with deliberate care. Tonya stepped forward to introduce herself, her demeanor warm but guarded against the underlying current of stress in the man's posture. Clara Moreau sat at a nearby table under an umbrella that filtered the afternoon sun into dappled light across her face. She held a tablet displaying complex financial charts, though she glanced up with a smile that seemed calibrated for maximum charm. "Welcome to our little sanctuary," she said, gesturing toward the garden where Ravetti continued her work. Her voice was fluid and confident, lacking any hint of hesitation even as she tracked Dario's approach to the group. Martin took in the scene without comment, noting how each person maintained their distance while pretending a casual ease that felt brittle under scrutiny. The sun began to dip lower over the lagoon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns where guests strolled in pairs or small groups. Tonya tapped her tablet screen one last time before slipping it into her bag, signaling they had seen enough for now. Signora Kessler had drifted out to the garden path at some point and stood watching them with quiet intensity. "Thank you for your hospitality," Tonya said. Martin offered a brief nod before turning toward the dock where their transport waited in the fading light. They walked away from the garden without looking back at the people standing among the flowers. The water taxi pulled away. The golden glow of the hotel shrank behind them as darkness settled over Giudecca Island. Martin leaned against the railing while Tonya reviewed her notes one final time, closing her device with a soft click. City lights bled across the black water, smearing gold and amber into the dark surface as the distant rooftops dissolved into the night sky above the lagoon. Neither spoke. They watched the shore recede, both knowing the quiet wouldn't last. They arrived at their temporary quarters in silence, set down their bags, and settled at a small table near the window with the city humming somewhere beyond the glass. Martin poured 2 glasses from the bottle between them. Tanya stared down at the canal, watching boats drift like ghosts through the mist. "Tomorrow we begin," Martin said, pressing his thumbnail into the table's edge as he turned over everything the island was still keeping from them. Tanya raised her glass and sipped, her eyes catching the flicker of the street lamps outside. 6:14 in the morning, and the lagoon lay flat and pewter under a sky that refused to lighten. Martin stepped off the water taxi onto the private dock, his boots clicking on wet stone as he moved past the cordon tape strung across the east wing entrance of the Belmont Hotel Cipriani. The facade looked serene, indifferent to the death inside its walls. Sergeant Tessari met him with a tablet displaying the overnight log. Fire suppression triggered at 11:052 p.m. Door breach at 12:003 a.m. Victim pronounced dead 12 minutes later. Martin ducked under the tape and followed Tessari down the corridor, where beeswax and scorched silk thickened the air, sweet underneath and acrid on top. The study door stood ajar. Inside, 6 bronze candlesticks formed a perfect hexagon around a high-backed armchair that was now nothing but charred skeleton. Each candle had burned down to an identical 2-centimeter stub of blackened wax. Martin crouched and swept his gloved hand beneath the ring of candles. He found no matches, no lighter, no gas port, no heating element buried in the ash or hidden under the rug. The room was a sealed box with nothing to explain, 6 simultaneous flames consuming a woman who had locked herself inside from within. He stood and brushed ash from his knees. "No ignition source of any kind," he said. "No match, no lighter, no gas feed, no electrical element. 6 candles do not light themselves simultaneously." He looked at the destroyed chair where Dr. Cosima Ravetti had sat. This room was constructed to look like an accident. The logic of it sat wrong in a way he could not yet name. Tanya worked the west quadrant near the window, her tablet glowing as she numbered evidence placements before touching anything. She crouched by the overturned side table and found a broken water glass alongside scattered entomology notes written in Ravetti's sharp hand. Beneath them lay a small rectangular device with one melted edge and a short antenna stub jutting from its casing. One face showed a partial logo of concentric arcs, and a micro USB port sat sealed in ash. She assigned it Item 47, typed unidentified electronics, fire damaged, and sealed the bag without pausing for analysis. At the study door, she photographed the Vela Smart Lock 3 panel, where the status light glowed solid green. The log showed biometric lock from inside at 10:031 p.m. with no re-entry recorded since. Tessari walked Martin back into the corridor and pulled up a duty report showing an altercation in the lobby 2 nights prior. A man named Dario Bellini had shouted at Ravetti while bar staff watched, his voice rising over her calm rebuttal regarding environmental data that threatened to close his glass furnace. Bellini was shouting at her, Tessari said, tapping the screen. His environmental case is being decided partly on her fieldwork, and her data is the thing dismantling it. Half the island knew he had reason to want her gone. Martin listened while writing the name in his notebook and circling it once with a light touch. He had closed 3 cases on obvious first answers. He had also left 2 open that burned him later. The name Dario Bellini felt too easy, like a door left ajar when everything else was locked tight. The terrace door at the corridor's far end stood open to the garden where foxgloves grew tall against wet stone. Martin stepped through and found Tanya already crouched at the bed beneath the study window. "The smart lock shows her locking herself inside at 10:031, she said, not looking up. "No re-entry, no forced breach, no tamper flag, from the inside." She rose and turned to face him. She gestured at the dark soil. "Martin, the garden bed under the study window. Someone was standing here last night, and it was not Ravetti. She was already inside when they stood here." A pause in which the lagoon traffic moved silently past. They were watching. Flat gray light bled into the east garden beds, where Tanya moved through tall foxgloves, her latex gloves snapping against the damp air. She traced the perimeter of Rivetti's insect trap array with a UV torch, the beam cutting through the morning mist to reveal sticky yellow cards and wire mesh cages on bamboo stakes. One stake near the east wall sat 2 centimeters out of alignment, pulled loose as if someone had used it for leverage. Crouching low, she spotted something caught in the lowest cage's mesh, a torn fragment of laminated card folded to the size of a postage stamp. She extracted it with tweezers and held it under the UV light. A partial face emerged, dark-haired, female, cropped at the jaw, and below it 2 lines of French text in the precise typeface of an official document. The laminate was intact on 2 edges, but cleanly torn on the others, suggesting haste rather than accident. She turned it over to find a faint, embossed security grid, the microprint pattern used in EU identity documents. Bagging the item as Evidence 61, she photographed it from 3 angles and made a single note: laminated ID fragment, provenance unknown, not Rivetti's survey materials. By the time Martin entered the West Lobby alcove, Ronaldo Spezia had already assembled an audience at the concierge desk. The artist stood with arms opened wide to the room, his pale linen jacket radiating a calculated ease, while he addressed hotel manager Giulia Fassi in a volume designed for the back row. His 4 installation crates remained roped off behind crime scene tape, untouched since yesterday's lockdown. "I require access," Spezia announced, turning to the assembled onlookers with an expression of luminous martyrdom. "The exhibition cannot wait while bureaucracy strangles art." Fassi repeated her explanation about building restrictions for a 4th time, her voice flat and uninflected. Martin watched from 12 meters away as Dario Bellini stood at the terrace balustrade beyond the glass, silent in a dark coat, observing the performance without moving a muscle. When the lobby commotion finally subsided, Martin approached Spezia and introduced himself. The artist pivoted instantly from outrage to warmth, claiming he barely knew Rivetti, a scientist who studied insects or something similar. He offered an alibi with unhurried precision: dinner in his suite, a Geneva call at 10, bed by 11. "How did you know she died in the evening?" Martin asked quietly. Spezia blinked, then smiled. "Doesn't everyone?" Martin stepped away from the desk and found Tanya waiting near the service corridor entrance to the kitchen. She had laid out 6 candles on evidence paper across a folding table, each removed from its bronze holder for wax scrapings from base, shaft, and pooled residue. The wax felt harder than expected under her tweezers, carrying a faint iridescence she noted as an unusual mineral quality with possible additives. She sealed 12 swab tubes in a forensics mailer addressed to the Venice Environmental Tribunal lab and handed it to the duty courier, who confirmed the Q status, 3 to 5 days minimum due to backlog. As she wrote ETL pending, hold no lines open in her case file, the service door opened and Marco Tessari entered without waiting for an invitation. The pilot wore a technical jacket that cost more than it admitted, his manner controlled and his eye contact warm, a dial he could adjust to whatever the moment required. He listed his evening timeline with confident fluency: dinner at 8, calls until 10, back in his room by midnight. "Where were you between 10:30 and 11:15? Tanya asked. Tessari paused one beat too long before answering that he was in his room on a call, though he refused to name the person he had been speaking with. Later, Martin found himself alone on the dock, waiting for the water taxi, the lagoon surface shimmering under the midday sun. He scrolled through his scene log until he reached item 47, Tanya's 4-angle photographs of the fire-damaged electronic device found in Rivetti's study. Pinching the image to zoom in, he focused on the device's underside, where a serial number sticker remained half-adhered beneath layers of ash and soot. 4 characters were legible through the grime BLW. He typed the string into his search query, but received no results from any public or private database. The silence of the lagoon pressed against him as he stared at the water, unable to explain why 4 letters on a burnt piece of unidentified electronics felt like the beginning of something rather than an end. The wind picked up off the canal, carrying the scent of diesel and salt as Martin pocketed his device. He thought about Spezia's smooth alibi. It covered every hour and yet explained nothing about how Spezia had known the time of death without being told. The man who claimed to barely know the victim had identified her moment of passing with casual certainty while performing for a crowd. 3 of the installation canvases in the lobby lacked visible provenance cards, and Martin noted they would require verification once the crime scene tape came down. Every one of these things could be nothing, he told himself, yet none of them felt like it. He thought of Bellini's still figure on the terrace. The man had not moved an inch during Spezia's theatrical display while everyone else reacted. The basement security hub smelled of recycled air and the faint ozone hum of servers running hot behind locked grills. Detective Martin sat across from Hotel Security Officer Bruni, watching the Vela Smart Lock interface glow on a wall display in the hotel's ivory and gold livery. The surface log was deceptively simple, 6 lines stating the door had locked at 10,000 300 p.m. via Dr. Rivetti's biometric signature, with no suicide, the case sealed before it had truly begun. Martin leaned forward, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Expand to the operational tier," he said, tapping the glass where a grayed-out directory sat dormant. Bruni hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard as if gripping something he could not put down. The officer explained that the quantum-resistant log existed but remained sealed behind a judicial access tier. The hotel could not open it unilaterally without a tribunal warrant. Martin noted the installation date from the 2026 renovation contract visible in the metadata, Bellini Vetro Artistico SRL. He requested a copy of that original installation agreement, his voice flat and devoid of urgency while he turned the implication over quietly, that someone had engineered a lock only they could bypass. Upstairs, in a repurposed linen room off the east corridor, Tanya worked with a portable spectrographic tablet propped on a folded ironing board. Evidence bags lined the shelf behind her, index numbers facing out like tombstones for data she had yet to understand. She fed the photograph of the torn laminated ID fragment into the EU Art Crime Register, expecting 0 hits given the degradation from heat and moisture. 11 seconds. That was all the match algorithm needed before it returned 3 results that made her lean in closer. The images were small and grainy, passport quality rather than portrait, yet the cheekbone structure, the set of the brow, and a slight asymmetry at the left corner of the mouth matched perfectly across all 3 entries. One name was Carla Marcello, another was an unlisted alias from 2 years prior. The third carried no name at all, only a provisional Interpol flag for forged documents under active inquiry. Tanya straightened, turning the possibilities over slowly, a single face wearing 3 different identities across 2 national borders. She photographed the screen output and labeled it Item 63 in her log. She did not call Martin yet. She needed to run this by the Interpol Forged Document Unit before naming it as a lead. Clara Moreau's suite overlooked the garden where Foxglove stood tall against the gray-green expanse of the Giudecca Canal. She answered Martin's knock wearing a silk blouse the color of old parchment and gestured for him to sit at her writing table with an ease that suggested she had been expecting this appointment all along. Her Italian carried a Parisian accent so controlled it felt like a professional choice rather than a birthright. She described ordering room service risotto, reading a French novel in bed, and sleeping early, no calls, no messages, nothing to verify the timeline. She volunteered that she had seen Dr. Ravetti alive in the corridor at 9:50 p.m., just before the lock event sealed the study door. The fluency of her recollection made Martin wonder how long she had been rehearsing this specific detail. She was always working on something, Moreau said, her gaze drifting toward the window and the flower beds below. That was the thing about Cosima. She could never leave a question alone. Her tone remained warm, yet the precision of her words created a distance that felt deliberate. Martin pressed further, asking if she knew Ravetti had been conducting an entomological survey in the hotel garden, specifically regarding chemical runoff from the Bellini furnace. Moreau did not flinch. Her eyes moved, just slightly, toward the foxglove beds visible over the low wall outside. "I know Dario was concerned about his pollinator numbers," she replied smoothly, framing the environmental dispute as a matter of business concern rather than personal animus. She spoke of Ravetti's work with a detached respect that masked any deeper knowledge of the toxic data collected in those very flower beds. Martin noted her composure, not as innocence, but as a data point. People who knew nothing about a murder showed confusion. She showed only calibrated stillness. He thanked her for her time and stepped out into the corridor, where amber light from the hotel fixtures cast long shadows against the Istrian stone walls. Standing in the quiet hallway with his tablet in hand, Martin reviewed his notes on the smart lock paradox and Moreau's alibi when a sharp chime struck the stone corridor and bounced back at him in a clean, hard echo. Tanya had attached item 63 to their shared case file with a single annotation, 3 names, 1 face. None of them are Ravetti's. He opened the attachment, watching the triple identity cluster resolve on his screen. He stood very still in the amber light of the corridor, while somewhere below him, through 2 floors of Istrian stone, the lagoon moved. Fiorina led Tanya through the data management suite on the lower ground floor, a space that looked like a 1950s telephone exchange rebuilt by someone obsessed with transparency. Glass-fronted server columns rose from the polished concrete floor, their soft aqua indicator lights pulsing in a rhythm that matched the hum of the cooling fans. Tanya took her seat at the guest terminal and initiated the bulk pull, booking records, room service logs, service entrance manifests, and the full restaurant AI archive. The dataset was 4.3 gigabytes, a heavy file that demanded patience rather than speed. 11 minutes into the review, the Dine and Dash alert flashed in the hospitality flags for Table 7 at 10:44 p.m. An unresolved carafe settled the following morning on the guest account. She marked it low severity and moved on without opening the embedded sommelier subfile. 8 entries below that flag, she found Ronaldo Spezia's installation manifest. His art crates had cleared the service entrance at 11:07 p.m. on the night of the murder. The fire suppression had triggered at 11:52, meaning those crates arrived 45 minutes before the heat sensors screamed. She highlighted the entry in amber and added a note to verify contents. The restaurant sat empty above her, chairs inverted onto tables like skeletal birds waiting for flight. A faint residue of beeswax polish coated the herringbone floor where Martin had asked Bellini to meet him, at Table 7 specifically. The Italian arrived in work clothes, his canvas jacket worn thin at the elbows, his hands carrying 40 years of furnace labor in their thick grain. He sat without being asked, possessing the stillness of a man who had made his decision and arrived at the far side of it. "I know Dr. Ravetti was concerned about my pollinator numbers," Bellini said, naming the lawsuit before Martin could ask for an alibi. Her expert testimony set back our environmental appeal by 18 months. He spoke with measured formality, quoting the cost of those delays without hesitation. Then he mentioned his daughter Vittoria managing the furnace accounts while he fought the tribunal, a domestic detail offered as casually as weather. "I dined here from 8:30, Bellini continued, accounting for the evening hour by hour. The Barolo arrived on time. I placed a phone order for my nightcap around 1:45 before heading upstairs. Martin watched his hands throughout the recitation. They did not move. Martin reviewed the room service delivery log alone at the maitre d' station, while Bellini walked back across the garden toward the Vaporetto stop, leaving the dining room with a silence that settled like sediment. The ghost order sat there on the screen, room 14, one measure of Vecchio Amaro, logged at 11:42 p.m. and delivered at 11:46. It was signed for on the in-room panel with Bellini's biometric thumbprint. The timestamp placed him ordering from the restaurant table while the fire suppression system remained dormant, then receiving the drink 6 minutes before the trigger. The alibi had no gaps, which made it worse than a lie would have been. Martin wrote "Ghost Order Verifies" in his notebook and drew a single underline beneath the words. He did not know what he was verifying or why such tidiness disturbed him so deeply. He capped the pen and looked out across the empty dining room toward table 7, thinking about a man who named everything and explained it all away. Tanya called Martin on her secure line to flag the Spezia crate timing anomaly. Her voice was structured and direct, listing the facts before offering an observation that felt colder than the data itself. "The crates arrived at 11:07, she said, 45 minutes before the fire suppression triggered. She paused, letting the implication stand without further elaboration, then rang off. She closed the bulk dataset, pushed back from the terminal, and stood. The ergonomic chair rolled silently on the polished concrete. She was halfway to the door when she stopped, turned back, and scrolled the restaurant log to the hospitality flag she had marked low severity and moved past. The sommelier subfile for table 7 still showed a 0 read count. It bothered her the way an unlocked door bothers a security officer who remembers locking it. She sat back down and opened it. The last recorded pour at table 7 was a 2023 Barolo, 187 milliliters, at 10:47 p.m. The table's reservation had run until 12:15 a.m. Tanya read that time, 10:47 p.m., and sat very still. The Venice Environmental Tribunal relay pinged at 08:14 a.m., a sharp digital chime cutting through the sterile hum of Conference Room B. Martin opened the 47-page spectroscopy appendix and navigated immediately to page 3, under the subsection, Anomalous Mineral Additive Profile. The text identified a proprietary flux compound consistent only with Bellini Vetro di Murano, high-temperature furnace batches, catalogued between 2024 and 2027. He pulled Dario Bellini's alibi record on the adjacent screen. Room service charged to room 14 at 11:23 p.m. for a nightcap, corroborated by an unbroken restaurant, AI attendance log showing presence until midnight. Martin typed one line in the case log. Bellini mineral flux in wax, anomaly noted, alibi solid, pending further context, and closed both files without escalating the finding. Across the workstation partition, Tanya had already pulled up the sommelier log from the bulk dataset she had initiated earlier. The timestamp column for table 7 showed a pour at 10:49 p.m. Then nothing until 11:47 p.m. She scanned the restaurant, AI's firmware revision history with practiced speed, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the desk edge. Firmware 4112 carried a known issue regarding intermittent buffer latency in the pour logging module, reported across 14 installations globally. She marked the 58-minute gap probable artifact, firmware 4.12, SU, and closed the file without extracting it to a separate record or cross-referencing it against Dario's claimed departure time. The data was clean enough to dismiss, yet the convenience of it nagged. She redirected her attention, pulling up Spezia's service entrance crate log instead. Her screen filled with timestamps and corridor camera stills as she began building a movement map of his deliveries against the East Wing surveillance feeds. The water terrace was empty except for Marco Tessari. He sat with an untouched espresso, watching the flat, colorless surface of the Giudecca Canal under morning overcast. Martin joined him without greeting, pulling out a chair that scraped harshly against the stone floor. Tessari confirmed his presence at the hotel throughout the previous evening before Martin pressed him about the specific window between 22,020 and 23,000, 3,000, 1,000, 3,000. 3,000 autonomous Vaporetto launch demonstration for the Venice Metropolitan Port's unmanned ferry program. As an early-stage investor, he had contractually agreed to witness the performance metrics in person. Martin asked him to account for the full duration of that observation window. Tessari described arriving at 22,020 and watching 3 continuous circuits until approximately 23,003, when he stepped away from the dock railing to take an incoming call on an encrypted channel. He paused, the deliberateness of a man weighing precision against approximation, before settling on perhaps 20 minutes. Maybe 23. When Martin asked for the call log, Tessari explained that the encryption protocol generated no accessible records for either participant, leaving him unable to produce metadata or content. "I remember the duration," he said, lifting his espresso cup for the first time since Martin arrived. "I cannot produce the content." Martin wrote 23 minutes in his notebook and underlined it twice, then looked out at the canal where gulls circled a floating log. 23 minutes. That was a specific number not to remember when police came asking. Tessari held himself with the rigid stillness of someone who had rehearsed this explanation until it felt natural. 23 minutes is a very specific thing not to remember, Martin said, his voice flat. He stood without waiting for a response and walked back toward the hotel entrance, leaving the pilot staring at the water. Martin returned to the coordination suite at 10,022 a.m. to find Tanya still mapping Spezia's movements across 2 monitors, while a cream note card sat on his desk, anchored beneath a branded pen. The concierge had written that Spezia checked out at 8:0947 with 2 cases, taking a private water taxi without leaving a forwarding address or transfer request. Martin read it twice, then opened the guest registry on his tablet to confirm that Spezia's reservation ran through Friday. He had simply walked out of it 3 days early. He picked up his jacket from the chair back. Tanya spoke without looking away from her screen. 40 minutes to Marco Polo by Vaporetto connection. If he left at 9:47, he is either already airside or he is not going by air at all. Martin was already moving toward the door before she finished. He pushed through the heavy glass doors into the humid Venetian air, diesel and saltwater thick on the morning. Spezia stood beside 2 tan leather cases on the Fondamenta della Zitel, the water taxi idling just below him. Martin came up from the hotel path. Before he could speak, Spezia raised one hand to signal the driver, cutting the engine. The sound cracked off the canal wall and died. The morning air was damp with algae and diesel, heavy against the skin. "She named a figure," Spezia said, his voice steady, as though discussing art inventory rather than extortion. "I paid it in 2 tranches, over 48 hours, structured as a conservation consulting fee for my own protection." He turned to face Martin fully. His dark glasses gave back only gray water. "She confirmed receipt by encrypted message 2 days before she died and made no further contact with me." Martin stopped 3 paces away, watching the man who had just dismantled his primary motive for murder in a single breath. If she was paid and silent, why is she dead? Who couldn't or wouldn't find the same solution you did? Spezia spread his hands, palms open, a gesture of calculated surrender that read more like an accusation than cooperation. Whoever she moved on to next lacked my pragmatism. Or my liquidity. He stepped down into the taxi as if the exchange were already settled, the low engine note resuming before Martin could press him further on the second target. The water churned white behind the hull and then smooth, leaving only the cold fact of Spezia's departure and the larger question he had taken with him. Back in Conference Room B at 11:05 a.m., Tanya sat before the forensic display where Item 47 rested on a high-resolution scan from the initial scene documentation. She zoomed until the matte black object filled the screen, revealing a partial adhesive label that had survived the heat better than expected: Loomis. The word sat in clean, sans-serif capitals, followed by a model string she ran against the EU hardware registry with 3 taps of her finger. 6 seconds. A product photograph loaded. A sleek cylindrical remote transmitter beneath the heading Loomis Candlesync 3, Wireless Remote Synchronized Ignition System. The description specified simultaneous ignition of up to 12 wicks via encrypted 5 GHz carrier signal over an operational range of 400 meters. Tanya read the technical specifications 3 times before opening the registration portal and entering the 8 visible serial digits from the forensic scan. A record began to load, the account status field reading I inactive, the holder name flickering into existence for only a moment. The first character appeared, then the second. The session timed out. The display reset to blank white space, leaving ownership unresolved. She stared at the empty page for 10 seconds, then switched tactics and ran a regional distributor search across the mainland registry. 3 results. 1 in Mestre, another in Treviso, and a third registered directly on Murano Island, where glass furnaces still burned hot enough to melt sand into art. Martin was crossing the main lobby when his phone buzzed with a call from Tonya. She walked him through the findings in rapid succession: Item 47, the product page, the 400-meter range, the preloaded receiver filaments, and when she finished, she said, the candles were set before she ever locked the door. The room was prepared, possibly days in advance. Her voice through the earpiece was flat and precise. One of the 3 Loomis distributors in the region is registered in Murano. The registration session timed out before I got the account name. Martin stopped near the glass wall. The lobby's amber underlighting caught the surface of the canal behind him, breaking it into small, bright fragments of gold and gray. He was quiet for a moment. Then, pull the Murano distributor's sale records. Last 18 months, every unit sold, and every account name on the register. He ended the call and stood still in the center of the lobby, thinking about a spectroscopy appendix, page 3, and a single annotation he had typed at 08,014 a.m., and then closed, anomaly, alibi solid, pending, and about the distance from a furnace on Murano to a hotel room on Giudecca, and whether, in the right conditions, 400 meters might be close enough. Tessari stood at the terrace balustrade with his back to the canal, dressed in a dark linen jacket, one register too formal for a Tuesday morning. He began speaking before Martin reached him, his delivery measured and deliberate, stripped of its usual nautical cadence. 8,000 euros, he said. Spezia had transferred it to a secondary account under Tessari's studio name the morning after the fire. The pilot recited the transfer reference number with mechanical precision, then explained that Rivetti had possessed expert documentation regarding forgeries in the lobby installation. All Spezia had needed was 2 confirmed hours at the launch accounted for, enough to walk away from the blackmail threat entirely. Martin recorded the data and set his tablet face down on the rail while a water taxi idled 20 meters out, its engine pulsing low in the cold air. The lagoon stretched flat and gray beneath an overcast sky. "Did you know Rivetti was dead before or after the transfer arrived?" Martin asked. Tessari paused for 4 full seconds, his gaze fixed on the horizon where San Giorgio blurred into mist. Inside the evidence suite, Tanya had already pulled the Spezia payment node onto the main display by the time Martin walked in. She worked the drop-down, reclassifying the entry from murder deposit, unverified, to settled blackmail confirmed. The suspect probability matrix updated instantly. Spezia's weighted score dropped 14 points while Tessari's fell to 0, the redistributed mass concentrating on a single remaining cluster near Murano. Clara Moreau entered through the side door carrying a personal effects recovery form, then stopped when she saw the reclassification tag glowing on the monitor. She read the label with quiet attentiveness that suggested she understood exactly what such a shift meant for the investigation's trajectory. Was Rivetti running more than one of those at the same time? She asked, her tone precise and devoid of affectation. Martin lobbed the question verbatim. Moreau collected her form and left without elaborating. Tanya watched her go and turned back to the screen, saying nothing as the digital trail continued its silent work. Martin sat alone at the archive terminal. He opened the Vela SmartLock developer portal under the Europol warrant extension he had secured that morning. The advisory distribution file lay nested 4 directories deep inside a 2026 product liability compliance folder, time-stamped to the week of the Cipriani's renovation contract. He sorted the recipient list by surname and watched the B entries load in alphabetical blocks. Bellini Vetro Artistico SRL appeared 6th from the top, with Dario Bellini listed explicitly as the contracting signatory for the system update. The advisory had been received at the furnace workshop address in Murano on 14 September 2026. An automated read receipt confirmed it that same afternoon. It was never forwarded to a hotel client or any third-party contractor. Martin printed the page without circling the name or drawing an arrow toward it, then placed the sheet face up on the evidence table and photographed it against the surrounding evidence. The ink was still damp when he set it down. One name, Dario Bellini, sole recipient of the Critical Security Advisory, its contents never shared, never passed on. That single fact reoriented the entire investigation away from the hotel staff and outward toward the furnace workshops where the wax residue had originated. Every witness who had claimed ignorance about the lock's vulnerability had been telling a truth they genuinely believed. Only Bellini had possessed the means to exploit it. The environmental complaint over pollinator runoff remained a secondary motive. Everyone had grasped instinctively, yet it had masked a deeper layer of technical knowledge deployed with a specific purpose. The wax residue confirmed it further, the proprietary flux compound traced directly back to Bellini's furnace, to tools no one else possessed. Tanya did not look at the printed sheet. She was watching her Dow anonymizer progress bar climb steadily across the monitor, the trace having just cleared 78% of the third mixer layer, stripping away the digital camouflage concealing the true ownership chains behind the anonymized accounts. "By morning," she said, adjusting her glasses as she leaned toward the screen. Martin looked up from his notes. "By morning what?" She kept her eyes on the scrolling code. "We'll have a name," she replied, stating it as fact rather than prediction. Martin did not ask which name, he already knew. Amber light from 3 terminal screens cut through the dark data suite at 11:14 p.m., picking out slow-drifting motes suspended in the stagnant air. The DA anonymizer had stalled at 91% for 22 minutes. Tanya sat motionless before it, watching. Then the progress bar surged, cleared its final mixer layer, and a sharp chime echoed off the glass walls. A wallet address resolved on screen, followed immediately by a verified identity node in standard Europol formatting, Carla Marcello. She read the details twice, her fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. Identity fraud, operationally dormant since late 2027, a sealed cross-reference attachment from Interpol. She printed the resolution certificate on heavy stock paper, tucked it under her arm, and walked down the corridor to Martin's evidence room at a pace that stopped just short of running. Martin stood by his evidence table when she entered, the scent of old coffee and ozone hanging in the small space. He took the certificate from her without asking for an explanation, scanning the name Carla Marcello with the particular stillness of a man cataloging threat. He moved to the terminal, typing the alias into the Interpol Open Fraud Registry while remaining on his feet. 3 flags returned immediately, each one a red marker against a white background. Martin requested the sealed Europol file attached to the 3rd flag and watched as his credentials cleared the first authentication gate. A secondary biometric confirmation generated an 11-minute countdown timer that ticked down with mechanical patience. When the file finally opened, it contained 43 pages of dense operational data. He read the executive summary, then the identity matrix, until he found the name Vittoria Bellini listed as a courier for the Serpent's Crown network since spring 2026. He did not react visibly to the discovery, though something settled hard behind his eyes as he processed the connection between the daughter and the father. Martin printed the first 8 pages, the timeline pages, and carried them back to the evidence table. Dario Bellini's movement log lay spread out there in parallel rows of black text on white paper. He laid the new printout beside the old document, aligning their edges with a precision that suggested he was building something structural rather than merely reading. The payment deadline for the blackmail demand sat at the 23rd, while Dario's first logged arrival on the island marked the 18th. 5 days separated them, wide enough to read a threat and make a decision about how to answer it. Vittoria had made no payment in her operational record, taken no protective action against the demand, and initiated no contingency protocol with the network. She didn't know he was going to do it, Martin said, his voice carefully neutral as he stared at the 2 documents side by side. Tanya pulled a chair closer, studying the timeline where the daughter's silence met her father's arrival. Or someone else decided she didn't need to know, she replied, tapping the page with a manicured nail that clicked against the paper. Martin nodded slowly and slid the movement log until its edge aligned perfectly with the payment deadline on the printout. He read them again as a single document, watching how the 5-day window resolved from a coincidence into a calculated decision, a conclusion the data had been moving toward since the first morning's evidence. He was here 5 days before she was due to pay, he said, flat and final. He didn't come to watch, he came to decide. Tanya moved back to her terminal without waiting for further instruction and pulled up the Chapter 4 bulk data queue. 3 items remained flagged as unread on her screen, glowing with a soft blue light in the dim room. She did not open the 3rd one, but instead slid the tablet across the table toward Martin until it stopped at his elbow. The file name was clearly visible on the screen. Sommelier Log Table 7, 229922 unread. The date embedded in the name marked the 22nd, the day before the deadline, 2 days after Dario's arrival. Martin looked at the file for a long time without speaking. Then he reached for it. The room had grown still and heavy with the recognition that the man who had built this murder was not the courier in the shadows, but her father standing in the light. Under a strip light that hummed with a low electric buzz, the steel table held the printed log. Martin smoothed the paper flat with both hands, his fingers tracing the rows of data until they found Table 7. He read the entry 3 times without moving. Last service at 10:47 p.m. Gesture tap payment cleared at 11:02 p.m. Gesture tap payment cleared at 11:02 p.m. No return flag existed to suggest Dario Bellini ever came back to that table. He pulled up the biometric door log for room 14 on his adjacent tablet, dragging the timeline until it sat parallel with the sommelier record. The room did not register a biometric entry until 12:31 a.m. A ghost order for a nightcap had been placed at 11:14 p.m. from inside a room whose door remained sealed for another hour and 17 minutes after the transaction finished. Martin dipped his pen in blue ink and wrote, "Not buffer, 58 min departure." Gapes in the margin, underlining it twice and pressing a third line beneath. Tanya stood at the far end of the table where the drone network terminal cast a cool glow across her face. She kept her jacket on, as if ready to walk out the door the moment this sequence completed. The Venice Giudecca thermal corridor feed loaded frame by frame, rendering low-resolution orange and gray blocks against the dark water. At 11:14 p.m., a figure entered from the south path where the Foxglove beds showed up as cool blue-green smears against the warmer stone borders. The gate biometric overlay, derived from Dario's hotel check-in scan, calibration parameters locked, climbed in the corner of the screen, 81, 87, 91, then 94.3%. The number held steady for 11 seconds while she took a screenshot and timestamped it. She turned to the Loomis manufacturer registration archive next, entering the hardware sub-identifier from item 47, which had sat in her notes since the evidence walkthrough at Serpent's Crown without a clear owner. The record resolved instantly. Bellini Vetro Artistico SRL Registrant Dario Carlo Bellini, dated 14 March 2024, status inactive, last updated Q4 2025. She stared at the screen for a moment before speaking. 94.3% confidence is not an ambiguity, she said. The device was registered to him 2 full years before Vittoria ever set foot inside Serpent's Crown. Martin assembled 4 sheets of paper in a vertical column on the evidence table, placing each proof in the order it had arrived from its respective data stream. He laid down the DA anonymizer wallet resolution linking Carla Marcello first, followed by his sommelier gap printout with its blue ink annotation marking the 58-minute void. Next came the drone thermal screenshot showing the gate overlay confidence at 94.3%, and finally, the Loomis registration printout displaying Dario's name alongside that March 2024 date. 4 documents. He read down the column once, his eyes tracing the independent convergence of 4 separate data points into a single, unbroken line. He activated the Europol voice entry system and dictated the formal arrest warrant, his voice level and devoid of inflection as the legal language dropped into the record at 09,117,004 a.m. A concierge automated checkout notification blinked on his secondary tablet. Bellini D had departed at 08,044 a.m. with no forwarding address requested. Tanya opened the airline booking cross-reference under emergency access and turned her screen toward him without speaking. The booking data resolved on her screen: Milan Malpensa, departure time 11,005 a.m., gate C14, boarding commences at 10,035, current status open. Tanya checked her watch against the digital clock on the wall. It was already 09:23 a.m. Martin looked from her screen to the column of evidence one last time. 58 minutes is not a firmware artifact or buffer latency, he said. It represents a man who was somewhere else entirely at the exact minute those candles were supposed to be burning in that locked study, the same minute the drone placed him on the south path. Tanya nodded once, the line of her mouth flattening to a seam as the timeline resolved into a single, inescapable point. "He is not fleeing to avoid capture," she replied. "He has already checked in and is waiting for a flight he knows will take him away before we can intercept him." The realization settled like a closing door. No shock, no dramatic revelation. Martin capped his pen and set it beside the warrant. The procedural phase had turned to execution. The 4 proofs stood together on the steel surface, an unassailable chain linking Dario Bellini to the night of Ravetti's death, assembled from data streams that had never touched each other. Tonya was already typing, her fingers rapid on the terminal keys, alerting airport security and local authorities to the suspect's presence at Marco Polo. Her gaze held on the departure gate confirmation as she spoke again. The distinction between a man running from justice and one who has simply finished his work matters less than getting to him before he boards. Gate C14 opened onto a long hall where floor-to-ceiling glass faced north-northwest across the lagoon toward Murano. The water beyond was silver-gray in the late morning, the outline of the island just visible at the horizon, like a smudge on wet paper. Martin and Tanya moved through the terminal at a controlled pace after clearing security with Europol credentials, reaching Gate C14 at 10,031. They didn't run. There was nowhere for him to go. Dario Bellini stood at the glass with his back to the room, a single carry-on bag resting at his feet, both hands hung loose at his sides. He watched the water without turning as they approached, and when he finally shifted, it was only after catching their reflection in the pane. He registered no surprise, only a quiet recognition that suggested he had expected this particular door to open for some time. Martin stopped 3 paces away and presented the warrant on his credential panel. Dario read the text without touching the screen, then extended his wrists. The gesture was unhurried. It read less as submission than as the completion of a task long in progress. Tanya moved in to conduct the custody search, unzipping the carry-on onto the nearest bench, where she found only folded clothes, a dog-eared paperback with its spine cracked at the midpoint, and a printed photograph in a transparent sleeve. The image showed a young girl standing at the mouth of a Murano furnace with green-tinted safety goggles pushed up onto her head, while Dario's hand rested on her shoulder. Both looked directly at the camera. She photographed it, bagged it as personal property, then checked his jacket pocket and found a phone, factory reset, and blank save for its model number. A gate agent approached the boarding desk with a lanyard key and a practiced smile until Tanya stepped forward and spoke 2 quiet words that sent her retreating while the screen went dark. Martin stated the formal charges in sequence, his voice level as he listed murder in the 1st degree, premeditation established across a documented preparation interval, and technological concealment via the Vela SmartLock 3 exploit alongside the Alias candlesync remote ignition device. The drone network had placed him at the scene with 94.3% confidence, while spectroscopy confirmed his proprietary flux compound on the wax residue. Tanya's decryption of Dr. Rivetti's encrypted messages had revealed a pattern of leveraging professional discoveries into private payments, and the quantum-resistant operational log showed how Bellini Vetro had installed hidden access tiers for Darini Vetro had installed hidden access tiers for Dario alone. Dario stood in cuffs, his gaze locked to a point in the air between them where each accusation came to rest. Overhead, the departures board cycled silently, Milan Malpensa, gate closed. He looked at Martin directly for the first time. No performance, no plea. He spoke with the flat certainty of a man reading from a document composed long ago, one he had always known would eventually be demanded of him. She was going to take my daughter from me. It was not an explanation. It was a statement of fact as he understood facts, complete and irreducible, requiring no response from Martin, earning none from the investigation record. The Serpent's Crown pipeline had been built over 6 years through legitimate channels until Rivetti found the fault lines beneath it. But those details now mattered less than the single image Dario had carried out of his life. Martin stood in the departures terminal with nothing more to ask. The phone was bagged and sealed. Outside the glass, the lagoon took the morning light and gave nothing back, indifferent to what burned beside it. Rain slicked the tarmac at Marco Polo Airport, turning the runway lights into blurred streaks of amber and white. Detective Martin stood by the terminal exit, watching the police transport vanish into the gray mist that clung to the lagoon. The arrest felt heavy in his chest, not with triumph, but with the dull ache of a job finished too late. He adjusted the collar of his coat against the damp chill seeping through the fabric. Beside him, Tanya tapped her tablet screen one last time before sliding it into her bag. She did not look toward the departing transport that would have taken Bellini away if they had been minutes slower. "The day Anonymizer cleared the Carla Marcello alias," she said, her voice flat and measured, precise in the damp quiet. "3 identities for one woman. Vittoria Bellini used them to move money through the Serpent's Crown network before disappearing." Martin nodded slowly, watching a maintenance drone hover over a puddle near the curb. He had seen the photograph of the young girl in Dario's bag, the face that had moved a man to burn an entire life down. "The ID fragment found in Ravetti's study," he murmured, "wasn't just trash." Tanya turned her head slightly, her dark eyes sharp behind her glasses. It was a piece of Vittoria's old passport, torn and concealed where the entomologist kept her most sensitive records. "The footprint under the window," Martin continued, stepping closer to the glass wall that overlooked the canal. "It matched the sole pattern on Bellini's boots, the pair catalogued 2 years earlier." He did not need to say more. The drone footage and the gait analysis had already confirmed his presence in the garden before the fire started. Tanya tucked a loose strand of braids behind her ear, a small gesture that broke her usual rigid posture. "He didn't just kill her for pollinator data," she said, shaking her head. "The environmental report was secondary. He killed her because she found Vittoria." The realization settled between them like silt after a disturbance, slow and irrevocable. Martin pushed off the glass wall and walked toward their waiting car, his boots clicking on the wet pavement. The case was closed, yet the silence in the vehicle felt louder than the rain hammering the roof. They had solved the locked room, traced the remote ignition, and exposed the financial web that bound Bellini to a criminal network. But the girl remained missing, another ghost added to the Lagoon's long list of lost things. Tanya started the engine, her hands steady on the wheel as she navigated back toward Venice. "What happens now?" Martin asked, watching the airport lights shrink in the side mirror. "We file the report," she replied, without looking at him. "Then we wait for Interpol to find Vittoria." The car moved through the causeway tunnels, leaving the airport behind as they returned to a city that held its secrets the way the Lagoon held its dead, quietly and without apology. Martin closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the wipers clearing the rain from the windshield. Bellini sat in a cell waiting for trial, and the truth about Ravetti's death sat cold on the record. Tanya merged onto the final stretch of causeway, the lights of Venice rising ahead through the mist like embers refusing to go out. Martin opened his eyes as they crossed the bridge, watching the dark water churn below. "Let it go," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "We did our part." He looked out at the water one last time before turning to face the road ahead.